Hi guys, Brook Potter here, coming to you live from Essex in the United Kingdom. In this video, I'm doing my appendix to the last Religion Zero episode that we did, Religion Zero for number 4, the Bible and the Red Pill, the continuation of the discussion between me and the panelists, including Corey, Bobby Leon, and my co-host for the 10K Run podcast, Amos Joe. A lot of interesting topics were bridged in terms of understanding the Bible, and I wanted to do a video kind of expanding on a couple of the points if people wanted to kind of study this out a little further. So the first thing I wanted to address was very early on in our conversation, we got into a discussion surrounding the Genesis narrative. And, just to spice things up, I threw up this rather obscure interpretation of the creation narrative surrounding Eve and how it wasn't actually a rib that had come out from Adam. And I suggested that it was quite possibly a possible translation was in fact the female genitalia, suggesting that Adam in his original form could have very well been a hermaphrodite, almost having both male and female genitalia, and God removed the female genitalia to create woman. Now this is not a doctrine that I'm going to die on the hill for. I for one do not take the Genesis narrative to be historical. I think it's trying to convey certain principles. But at the same time, I thought this was a very interesting interpretation. I'd never heard it before, so it piqued some people's interest. And I got this from actually a lecture from Pastor Clyde Pilkington, I think. This was a gentleman that Corey put me on his work on marriage and sexuality and stuff like that. Definitely very interesting perspective. I've never heard that before. And in the reference of his lecture, he referenced the work of Alfred E. Knoch, who was a Bible commentator around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century. Now, I don't agree with everything that Knoch has written. Some of his doctrines are definitely a little more questionable, but his paper on the building of a woman was a very interesting take. I'd never heard about that before. And I thought, I'm trying to make the show interesting by throwing in some interesting tidbits for people to follow up. If you want to read that paper, I, of course, will put a link to it below. Again, not everything Knoch wrote about in his commentaries and his views on God and the divinity of Christ and stuff. I don't agree with everything, but this was an interesting piece of commentary. So, people are more than welcome to disagree with it. It's not important, but I thought it would definitely spice up the conversation. And again, the point of raising that was not that I thought God was a hermaphrodite and I wasn't making any statement about sexuality or anything along those lines, but again, that God is the source of all creation and everything that exists has basically been pulled out of himself. So there are places in the Bible where we see God, displaying feminine characteristics or even being described as feminine. The woman seeking the lost coin in the book of Luke 15, 8-10, God is depicted as the woman seeking out the lost coin, which is, fallen Israel, or in another translation, it might be considered, the unbelievers in some cases. Of course, Matthew 23:37, as I discussed in the show, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather thee, as a hen would gather her chicks. God is the hen seeking to gather, her children, which is Israel. And I mean, even in the Genesis account, Genesis 5:2, God says, let us make man in our image, and he made them male and female. So again, everything that exists comes from God, and that includes all of the feminine attributes. Every person who's ever existed, all of the attributes and characteristics they have are parts of God. He dreamed us up before the creation from parts of himself. So everything that exists comes from him. And the point I was making was not that God is female or that he's a hermaphrodite and there's nothing about sexuality. It's just that the feminine aspects to humanity are also included in God. And that was the main point I was trying to make. The next part of the discussion, we just kind of touched on this idea of the end times. And the different branches of the church have different interpretations, and I've made it a point to say that, look, nobody has end times eschatology figured out clearly. The church, for the most part, has always contained at least 4 views on the issue of end times. There's the preterist, which is closest to what I believe. I'm between a partial and a full preterist. It's not exactly clear. But preterism believes in the past. It believes that the book of Revelation was in their future, as in the time of Christ, the book of Revelation was predicting what was future to them, but it has happened in our past. Now, there's different streams, of course, within preterism. Some believe that the events took place during the time of Domitian. Some believe it took place during the time of Nero. I personally hold to that. The work by Kenneth Gentry and his PhD work on the naming of the beast, that was very convincing. I think there's actually a lecture that he's done on that. I'll see if I can source that and put links to it below as well. But apart from preterism, there is, of course, futurism. And there are different strains of futurism. These believes that the book of Revelation is still to come in our future. And from that, we have also rapture theology or dispensationalism. That is a form of futurism. But of all the interpretations, I think that's the weakest. It's the most recent. It is not a very old doctrine or eschatological view. It's only been around for, I think, maybe a couple hundred years. We don't really see rapture theology in the original sources. But I mean, like I said on the show, look, nobody's got this figured out. If there's a rapture, there's a rapture. I was wrong, sue me. Then there's also, within the realms of eschatology, there is the idealist view, which basically thinks that the entire thing is spiritual. Some people believe it is the grand epic between the spirits of good and evil without any physical manifestations on the earth. So it's all allegorical, it's all spiritual, and we don't actually see any kind of fulfillment in the earth. Some people would take that a little bit further and say that this is the internal struggle of every generation that has to overcome evil, and there's again the battle between good and evil. Some would even take it either further than that and say that this is an individual depiction, that every person internally will have that struggle between good and evil. But the basic premise in the idealist view is that it is allegorical, it is spiritual, there doesn't have to be any physical manifestations, and it usually centers around the good triumphing over evil. And the last view is the historicist view, which we do have a couple early sources that suggest this, which play into the idea that the book of Revelation is actually continuing since the time of Christ and being fulfilled throughout history. And we go through different ages and different dispensations within the ages, and you're seeing different historical events kind of lining up and so forth. It's a little more tricky because it's very hard to pin down key characters in history to latch on to these things. So the character of the beast, for instance, some believe that was Adolf Hitler, for instance, or the city that's seated on 7 hills. We know that is Rome. At the time of Christ, it was probably known as Rome. Some people today try to point to the Catholic Church. And again, when you're trying to interpret history through a biblical lens and try to impose it on historical events, it does get very confusing. You can ask 3 different historicists who are the major players throughout history and get 3 different answers, and we don't know when one age begins and when another one ends and so forth. So the horsemen and stuff like that, each of those would be like the Dark Ages into the Enlightenment and different things like that. There are some aspects of that I agree with. But then again, it's very subjective how you interpret it. Which view is right? I have no idea. I think the strongest view tends to be the preterist view. Doesn't mean they don't have holes. Doesn't mean that I understand everything in that. And again, I will put links to anybody who wants to listen to Gentry's work. Of course, Don Prescott is very big on the full preterist position, as well as Gary DeMar. He's done some great work. So yeah, if you want to learn more about these things, definitely look into all of those things. Gary DeMar's work on the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 is exceptional, and he's done a number of lectures on this topic. And again, you don't have to agree. End times is not a key doctrine. It is not an important doctrine. So we can differ on the views of end times. A lot of people are unfamiliar with this, so I just wanted to explain. Yeah, the church has 4 views. It has a lot of views on a lot of topics that some people are not aware of. And it doesn't hurt to consider other positions. That's how we're all trying to learn. We're all trying to, figure this stuff out. So yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about that. So the final point that I want to touch on is something that was brought up in the conversation concerning the relationship of covenant theology and the role of Jesus Christ with natural Israel. And this comes into the idea of what's known as replacement theology. Now, replacement theology is not the teaching that the church has replaced natural Israel as God's chosen people. That is not the depiction that we see throughout Scripture. Biblical replacement theology is that Jesus Christ has replaced natural Israel and assumed their identity on their half of the covenant and fulfilled the law and the promises, for all people. So what we see in the book of Matthew, for instance, which is often depicted as the gospel to the Jews, this parallel between Jesus Christ and natural Israel. So I said in the broadcast that, natural Israel was called out of Egypt. We see the same thing in the life of Jesus Christ, where Jesus Christ was also called out of Egypt. We see that natural Israel was baptized going through the Red Sea. In the same manner, John the Baptist baptized Jesus Christ. We also see that, natural Israel went around the wilderness for 40 years. We also see Jesus Christ going into the wilderness and fasting for 40 days. And then we see Moses giving the law on the sermon, coming down from Mount Sinai. And in similar depiction, we see Jesus Christ doing the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew. So what is going on? And if you read Matthew, there's a constant referral back to the old scriptures. In the time when the Old Testament was depicting these depictions, such as Hosea 11:1, my child, I have called you out of Egypt. Matthew takes that fulfillment of Hosea 11:1, which at the time was talking about natural Israel, and Matthew is saying, no, the true fulfillment is Jesus Christ being called out of Egypt. And over again, Matthew is constantly pulling these Old Testament scriptures that in times past were referring to the depiction of natural Israel, and then he's referring and saying, no, the actual fulfillment of this was in the person of Jesus Christ. So what is going on? As I said in the broadcast, God was in covenant with the nation of Israel, their continued disobedience. The only way to fulfill the promises was for God to step into their side of the covenant. Jesus Christ came, born under the law. He was a Jew, and he walked under the law, and he fulfilled the law perfectly. But in doing so, he was the vicarious representative of the Jewish nation. He absorbed all aspects of their history and other things, and he became true Israel in that sense. Now, this is not some kind of anti-Semitic rant against Israel or Jews or anything like that. I'm just saying on the spiritual aspect, this was God's perspective. Now, of course, in the natural, we still see the Jews. We see them as, a family bloodline and these other things. That's not the conversation I'm having. In terms of theology, this is the depiction that's taking place. And Jesus came and through his sacrifice and so forth, he tried to redeem the people from the coming judgment that I believe was 70 AD. And after he'd done all that he could, and even 3.5 years after his ministry, when his 12 disciples went out and continued preaching the message that Jesus was the Messiah to the Jewish people exclusively, I believe at the stoning of Stephen marked the end of the gospel to the Jews exclusively. Up until the point of the stoning of Stephen, all of the preaching that we see taking place is to the Jews exclusively. And that's when we get this conversation, I believe, in Isaiah 49 verses 1 to 6, I believe, where the conversation is between God the Father and the Son is saying, I've spent my strength, I've given my all, Israel is still not gathered. And God says in response, it is a light thing that you should, take up just the sins of Israel. I have taken your work and now I've given it as a light to the Gentiles. The first Gentile convert is the house of Cornelius. That is when Peter gets the vision about the cloth coming down and so forth with all the different animals. And he says, God says to him, arise, kill and eat. And he says, I'm a Jew. I don't eat anything unclean. And God says, that which I have cleaned, do not call unclean. And the symbology of that was talking about the Gentiles, that Peter was now released to go and talk to the Gentiles. That only happens at the stoning of Stephen. And there are reasons why I believe that was when that conversation had taken place. But everything before that was entirely Jewish. It was the gospel to the Jews exclusively. And some people might point out, well, what about the upper room where they had all these different tongues that came in? Yes, I completely agree with that, but they were all Jewish pilgrims. They were Jews that had come throughout the nation, and they'd returned to Jerusalem as they would pilgrim for the feasts and festivals and other things like that. Historically understood, the first Gentile conversion was the house of Cornelius, and that happens after the stoning of Stephen, and Peter gets the revelation. So yes, with that said, those are just a couple of the points. You could completely disagree with me. That's just how I understand it. There's a lot to unpack in these issues if somebody wants to kind of explore those subjects a little bit more. I'll also, I've written a bit about this. I'll put some links to some articles below where you can get these points in more detail. So guys, that's my appendix for Religion Zero, episode 4. I hope you enjoyed it. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Leave questions, of course. We'll either address it on the show or I might do a video following up on the subject myself. And as always, thanks for watching. God bless.